Dear listeners, welcome back to another brand new story, so let's dive in. David Carter had always been the kind of man who believed in stability. He believed in the balance of life, where work and family existed in a perfect harmony, each supporting the other. A successful executive at a prestigious law firm in New York, David had carved out a life many envied. He had a beautiful, intelligent wife, Emily, whom he had married 10 years ago. They had a house in a quiet neighborhood in the Upper East Side, a place that seemed to represent everything they had worked for together. They had it all, or so it seemed. David and Emily's life had been nothing short of picture-perfect for the first few years of their marriage. They attended dinner parties together, took vacations to tropical islands, and hosted elaborate holiday gatherings. They were the couple everyone envied, their love a shiny example of a happy marriage. But recently something had shifted. The cracks were beginning to show, but David, too caught up in his demanding career, hadn't noticed until it was too late. It wasn't that Emily had changed overnight. It was the little things, the way she would come home later and later from the gym or her friend's place, the empty nights where he would find her glued to her phone, texting or laughing but never with him. She had begun to withdraw in ways that David didn't fully understand. And even if he had, he would have chalked it up to stress or just the natural ebb and flow of married life. But over time, David began to sense a distance. There was no longer the warm embrace when he came home after a long day, no spontaneous kisses or affectionate words. Instead, there were strained smiles, terse conversations, and a growing silence between them. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that maybe Emily was just busy. But there was a gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, one he couldn't quite shake off. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly grueling week at the office, David decided he would surprise Emily. He finished his work early, something he rarely did, and decided to head home to show her how much he appreciated her, to remind her of the life they had built together. It was meant to be a romantic evening, take out from their favorite Italian restaurant, wine, and just the two of them. As he approached their apartment, David felt a rare sense of excitement. He hadn't felt this way in months, the anticipation of spending time with his wife filling him with warmth. But that warmth quickly turned to cold shock as he opened the door. The apartment was dimly lit, the soft sound of laughter and low voices carrying through the air. At first, David thought it was the television, but as he stepped further into the living room, he saw them. Emily, his wife, sitting on the couch, laughing and smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years, her head thrown back in laughter, her body leaning into someone else. A man. Ryan. David had met him only a few months ago when Emily started going to the gym. He was a personal trainer, a handsome man with a charming smile and well-toned physique. He was professional, friendly, a harmless acquaintance, David had thought. How wrong he had been. Ryan's arm was draped around Emily's shoulders, their proximity far too intimate for any innocent friendship. The soft music in the background did nothing to mask the overwhelming feeling of betrayal that washed over David. The way they were looking at each other, the subtle touches, the closeness, it was clear that this wasn't just a friendly meeting. David felt his chest tighten as his pulse began to race. His mind screamed at him to say something, to confront them, but his body remained frozen in place. He was in shock. This couldn't be real. Emily, the woman he had loved for so long, the woman he had shared his life with, was sitting in front of him, laughing, smiling, and sharing something with another man that she should have been sharing with him. The sound of Emily's voice broke the silence, and David's heart dropped. She turned her head and saw him standing there. Her face drained of color, her eyes wide in panic. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ryan, still oblivious to the situation, sat up and looked around, his eyes widening when he saw David standing in the doorway. David's mind was swirling with 1,000 thoughts. His body felt like it was betraying him, refusing to move or speak. But then finally his voice broke through the shock. "Get out," he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. It was barely a whisper, but the weight of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ryan, who had just started to rise, stopped in his tracks and quickly grabbed his jacket. His eyes darted nervously between David and Emily. I'm sorry, I didn't mean," he stammered, but the words fell flat. David didn't even look at him as he turned toward the door. "Just leave," David repeated, his voice now sharp with command. Ryan didn't hesitate, rushing out of the apartment with barely a glance back at Emily. The moment the door slammed shut, silence enveloped the room. David stood there, his arms at his sides, fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. His mind was reeling, unable to process what he had just witnessed. His wife, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him, right in their home. Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "David, I didn't want you to find out this way. Her words were hollow, and David felt a bitter laugh bubbling up from inside of him. She didn't even sound sorry. Not really. David took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. But it was futile. He couldn't let this go. How long, Emily? His voice was low, but it was laced with venom. How long has this been going on? Her gaze fell to the floor and she bit her lip, her hands wringing together. The guilt was evident in her posture, in the way her shoulders sagged. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I didn't want to hurt you, David. Don't make excuses for me, Emily, David spat, stepping closer to her. You didn't care enough to stop it, did you? How long? She looked up, her eyes pleading, but she couldn't deny it. A few months, she whispered. It started slowly, but it turned into something more. I didn't mean to fall for him, David. David held up his hand, silencing her. His head was spinning. He had no idea what to do, no idea how to process what was happening. Just get out. I need to be alone. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. Please, David. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. No, he cut her off, his voice stern and final. You've already made your choice. Without another word, David turned and walked out of the room, his mind a swirling storm of emotions. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave. He needed time to think, to make sense of everything. His world had just been torn apart and he didn't know how to pick up the pieces. As he stepped out of the apartment, the door clicked shut behind him. He walked aimlessly down the street, not caring where he went. The city around him buzzed with life, but he felt like a ghost in it all. Emily had betrayed him. She had taken everything they had built together and shattered it into pieces. But deep down, something inside David had already started to change. A quiet rage was building, simmering beneath the surface. He couldn't let her get away with this. He would make sure of that. David's world felt like it had collapsed in on itself, like he had stepped into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had always trusted Emily. She was his partner, his confidant, the woman he thought he would grow old with. And now she had betrayed him with someone else. It was the kind of betrayal that cut deep, leaving scars David knew he could never forget. He found himself walking aimlessly down the crowded streets of New York, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge and what to do next. He couldn't just let this go, couldn't pretend like nothing had happened. Emily had made her choice and now, it was time for him to make his own. David had always been a man of reason. He was calm, calculated, and level-headed. But right now he felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in years, anger. His chest tightened with the rawness of it, and his fists clenched involuntarily. How could she do this to him? To them? As he walked, he couldn't help but remember the good times, the times when everything felt perfect. He had loved her with everything he had. But now that love felt like a distant memory, a fleeting illusion. The woman he had spent his life building a future with had thrown it all away. And for what? A few stolen moments of excitement with another man? He stopped in front of a small cafe, its warm light spilling out into the street. It was the kind of place he and Emily used to visit on weekends, enjoying quiet mornings with coffee and croissants. But now the thought of it made his stomach churn. Nothing was the same anymore. David turned away from the cafe and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number without thinking, his fingers moving quickly. It rang a few times before someone picked up. David? A familiar voice answered. Victor, David said, his voice rough, his anger evident. I need your help. Victor was David's best friend, a man who had been with him through thick and thin. They had known each other since college, and while Victor wasn't involved in David's personal life, he knew how to get things done. And right now that's exactly what David needed. What happened? Is everything all right? Victor asked, his tone laced with concern. David let out a breath, his anger boiling over. Emily. She's been cheating on me with some guy. I just found out. I don't know what to do, man. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and David could hear the tension in Victor's voice. Jesus, David. I'm sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through. What do you need? David's fingers tightened around the phone. He didn't know exactly what he needed. All he knew was that he couldn't just let this go. Emily had crossed a line and now there would be consequences. I don't know, David admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion. But I need to make sure she knows what she's done. I need her to feel it. Victor didn't hesitate. All right, listen. I know a guy. He's been in this business for a while. He specializes in, well, making people pay. If you want to hit back, he's the one you need. But I'm warning you, David. This kind of thing goes far beyond just confronting her. David's heart skipped a beat. This was serious. But at that moment he didn't care. His pain and anger were consuming him, drowning out any doubts. I don't care. Get me in touch with him, David said, his voice firm, determined. Victor paused for a moment before replying, okay. I'll send you the contact info. But remember, once you make that call, there's no going back. This guy, he's not someone you want to mess with. David didn't respond immediately. He just nodded to himself, staring at the pavement beneath his feet. He didn't want to think about the consequences right now. He just wanted Emily to know what it felt like to lose everything, to feel the same pain he was going through. After hanging up, David took a moment to collect himself. His hands shook as he looked at the message Victor had sent him. The name of the person was simple, unassuming, Agent. David could feel the cold weight of the decision he was about to make. But there was no turning back. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. Emily had taken something precious from him, and now, it was his turn to take something from her. With a steadying breath, David dialed the number Victor had given him. It rang twice before a voice on the other end picked up. You've reached Agent. What do you need? David hesitated for a moment. The voice was calm, detached, as if the man had heard everything before. Maybe he had. I need help, David said, his voice colder than he had intended. My wife, she's been cheating on me. I need to make her regret it. Make her feel the consequences. The voice on the other end was silent for a long time. Finally it spoke. Cheating is a dangerous game, the man said in a low tone. And you're not the first person to want revenge. But I'll warn you, this is not something that's going to stay between you and her. It'll spread. It'll affect your life in ways you can't predict. David knew exactly what he was getting into. He didn't care. His mind was set. Do it, David said, the finality in his voice unmistakable. I want her to feel the pain. The man on the other end of the line didn't ask questions. Instead, he gave David a set of instructions, things he needed to do, people he needed to contact, and arrangements he needed to make. It wasn't a long conversation, but every word, every sentence felt like it was pushing David deeper into a place he couldn't come back from. As the call ended, David stood still in the street, the weight of his decision settling in. He didn't know what the consequences would be, but he didn't care. He couldn't care. Not anymore. David's world had morphed into a war zone, one that he'd never imagined he'd find himself in. The betrayal was too much to bear, but it had pushed him beyond the point of no return. He wasn't sure if it was anger, heartbreak, or something darker that drove him now, but the path was set. Emily would regret what she had done. He couldn't just stand by and let it happen. His hands gripped the wheel of his car as he navigated the streets of Manhattan, each turn a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the life he once knew. The traffic lights blurred in his peripheral vision, his mind too consumed by the looming plan. The instructions from the man agent were clear, but they didn't feel real. How could they? This was more than just an act of revenge. It was a deep, personal shift in everything David had believed. But at that moment he didn't care. He was too far gone to turn back. David had arranged everything with meticulous care. The agent had given him a set of specific steps to follow, a series of delicate moves that would ensure Emily would suffer the way he had. A calculated financial ruin, the exposure of her affair, and something more personal, a loss that would hit where it hurt most. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his trance. It was a text from Victor, the only friend who knew what was happening. He had warned David about the consequences, but David was beyond listening. Victor, you sure about this? You don't know what you're getting into. This isn't just a breakup. It'll ruin everything. David's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. He could already feel the weight of his choices, but there was no undoing it now. He wasn't going to back down. David, it's done. I'm doing this. She needs to know what it feels like. The reply came quickly. Victor, just remember, you're not the only one who gets hurt in this. David didn't respond. He knew what he was doing, and nothing anyone said could change his mind. The time for second-guessing was over. Arriving at a sleek office building downtown, David walked through the revolving door and into the lobby. The floors gleamed, the air smelled sterile, and the soft hum of office chatter barely registered in his mind. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to waste time. The man he was meeting was waiting for him. David knew nothing about Agent's past, and he didn't care to ask. All he needed to know was that Agent was good at what he did, and he always got results. This wasn't about making sense. It was about getting even. As he stepped into a nondescript elevator, David stared at the numbers lighting up above the door. It seemed like a dream now, the life he had with Emily, the days of peace and contentment, the belief that nothing could tear them apart. All of it had been a lie. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor and the doors slid open. A single man sat in a stark, minimalist office, his back turned to David. Agent didn't even look up as David entered. "Sit down," Agent said in a low voice. David did as instructed, the cool, polished leather of the chair against his back offering little comfort. The silence between them stretched thin before Agent finally turned around, his gaze sharp, calculating. "You understand what's at stake?" Agent asked, his voice cutting through the air. David nodded. "I'm ready." Agent raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "We don't turn back from this. Once the pieces are in motion, they can't be undone. I hope you're sure." David's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm sure. Just tell me what I need to do." Agent handed him a folder, and David's eyes flicked over the contents. It was a blueprint, a map of his wife's life. Her finances, social media activity, private emails. The affair had been more than just a physical betrayal. It had been a well-planned deception that included financial manipulation, setting up secret accounts, and using her connections to distance herself from the truth. David could feel the blood drain from his face as he read the details. It was far worse than he'd ever imagined. "Let's start," Agent said. "First, we strip her of everything she's worked so hard to protect." Hours passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and decisions David never thought he'd have to make. He watched, numb, as Agent orchestrated every move with precision. Each step was more intense than the last, pulling David deeper into a world he couldn't escape from. But the pain of betrayal still gnawed at him, a hunger he couldn't ignore. Finally, it was time for the last phase of the plan. Agent had arranged everything, Emily's business dealings, her reputation. Everything was about to come crashing down. David was given the final piece of the puzzle, a video carefully edited that exposed her affair in the most humiliating way possible. The affair wasn't just an act of betrayal, it was the destruction of everything Emily had built. And David was about to push the button that would end it all. Standing in his office, David stared at the screen. The video was ready to be sent. It would be leaked to every person in Emily's life, her friends, her colleagues, even her family. There would be no escaping it. This was the end of everything she had known. For a brief moment, David hesitated. The weight of the decision was almost unbearable. This wasn't just a revenge act, it was a total dismantling of her life. He thought about the person Emily had once been to him. He thought about the times they'd laughed, loved, and planned for a future. And now none of that mattered. She had thrown it all away. With a deep breath, David pressed the send button. The world was about to find out who Emily really was. David's hand trembled as he watched the video disappear into the void of cyberspace. It was done. There was no going back. He felt his heart hammering in his chest, but it wasn't fear that pulsed through him. It was a cold, vindictive satisfaction. The devastation had begun, and he had set it all in motion. As the minutes ticked by, David felt strangely detached. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe some rush of triumph, maybe guilt, but all he felt was an eerie numbness. The next steps were already in motion, and now all he could do was wait. The first call came 2 hours later. "David, where the hell is Emily?" Victor's voice crackled through the phone, a mix of panic and confusion. "What did you do?" David took a breath, his voice steady. "I did what needed to be done. She's going to understand the consequences now. She'll feel the weight of what she's done." Victor let out a sharp exhale. "Man, I don't know if you realize the mess you've created. This is bigger than you think." David didn't reply right away. He wasn't interested in talking anymore. His mind was already on the next step, preparing for what was to come. Emily was no longer his concern, she was a casualty of her own actions. The next morning the world erupted. Emily's betrayal, laid bare for all to see, became the scandal of the century. The video, leaked to every social media platform, was now out there in the public eye. The messages, the steamy hotel room rendezvous, the whispered phone calls, it was all on display, exposed to thousands of eyes. The humiliation was swift and brutal. David watched from his apartment, the images of Emily's world collapsing before him. Her phone started blowing up with notifications and her inbox filled with emails. Her friends, her colleagues, even her family members, everyone knew. And with that knowledge came the venomous backlash. Her business began to crumble as clients and associates withdrew their support. Her social media following turned against her. She was no longer a beloved socialite, she was a pariah. David wasn't done yet. He had a few more pieces to play. Hours after the video had spread, Emily received an email, a professional-looking message that included screenshots of her personal and financial dealings. Her affair partner, once a shadow, was now fully visible. The exposure wasn't just about the affair, it was about the money, the lies, and the manipulation. She had siphoned money from their joint account to fund secret vacations with her lover, stashed assets away in hidden bank accounts, and faked business deals for her own gain. Everything was on display and there was nowhere to hide. David smirked as he read the email he'd just sent. He had arranged everything perfectly, her secret accounts, her investments. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse. And collapse it did. By the time Emily realized what had happened, her world was already in ruins. She called David, her voice frantic. "David, please, I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, don't do this to me." David leaned back in his chair, the weight of her pleas failing to stir any sympathy in him. "You did this, Emily. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. This is only the beginning." He could hear her choking on her words, the reality of what she had done finally sinking in. "David, please, don't take everything from me." But David hung up. He didn't need to hear any more. There was nothing left to say. The floodgates had opened, and Emily was drowning in the tide of her own mistakes. Days passed but the chaos only grew. Emily's social media was flooded with messages of disgust and outrage. Her business was under investigation, and authorities began to look into the shady deals she'd made. David's plan was working better than he could have imagined. But even as he watched her downfall unfold, part of him felt a strange emptiness. He had gotten everything he wanted, yet there was still a hollow space where satisfaction should have been. The press was relentless. Every news outlet had a headline about the scandal. Blogs, news websites, and tabloids all had their own version of the story, each more sensational than the last. David could see Emily's name at the top of every page, her face plastered across every screen. But this wasn't the Emily he had once known. This was a broken, discredited woman, someone who had lost everything. Then came the public confession. In a desperate attempt to salvage whatever dignity she had left, Emily took to social media. She posted a tearful video, admitting to the affair, apologizing to everyone she had hurt, and begging for forgiveness. She claimed she had been blinded by ambition, that she had lost herself in her quest for power. David watched the video, his expression unreadable. Emily's words were hollow, the apology insincere. She had ruined her own life, and now she was trying to claw back the pieces. But David knew that there would be no redemption for her. Not now, not ever. One final twist was waiting. David had kept one last piece of leverage hidden from Emily. With everything else crumbling around her, he waited until the right moment. It came 2 weeks later as Emily faced the final blow, a criminal investigation into her business practices. She sat in her lawyer's office, the walls closing in on her, when David's phone rang. It was a private number, and his gut twisted as he answered it. "David," the voice on the other end said, cold and emotionless. "Your wife's been arrested." The weight of those words hit David harder than he expected. Emily arrested. The sound of her world shattering felt almost too much to bear, but David was in control now. There was no hesitation, no regret. He had set this train in motion and there was no stopping it now. He sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. His thoughts raced, memories of their life together flooding his mind. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about proving to himself that he could control the chaos, that he could bend fate to his will. Emily had thought she was untouchable, a queen in her own right, but David had exposed her. He had watched her crumble, piece by piece. The arrest was just the final blow. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about everything she had stolen, the lies she had built her life on. The stolen money, the manipulative lies, the way she had discarded him like he was nothing. She had thought she could destroy him, but in the end, it was she who was left broken. News of her arrest spread quickly, another nail in the coffin of her public image. Emily was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and several counts of tax evasion. The affair partner, once a shadow in the background, was also arrested. The authorities began to unravel the full extent of the web of deceit she had woven, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. David knew that this was the moment she would crack. All the bravado, all the confidence she had once exuded, had crumbled to dust. The walls were closing in. As the days passed, Emily's world grew even smaller, her reputation in ruins, her financial empire collapsing. Her former friends distanced themselves, and her business was now under investigation for money laundering. The once powerful woman was reduced to a frightened, broken shell of herself. David wasn't done yet. He had one final card to play. It was a week after the arrest when David arranged the meeting. He had everything set up, the perfect place, the perfect time. The courtroom drama had begun, but this meeting was personal. It was his final confrontation with Emily, and he intended to make it unforgettable. He arrived at the dilapidated, nearly abandoned coffee shop that they used to frequent together, back when things were normal, before her lies had shattered everything. The dim lights flickered overhead, and the smell of stale coffee filled the air. It was the perfect setting for what he had in mind. David's phone buzzed. It was her lawyer, confirming she would show up. Emily was on her way. A few minutes later, the door opened and Emily walked in. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. The confidence she had once carried so easily was gone, replaced by desperation. She still wore the same designer clothes, but they looked out of place now, shiny, new, and expensive amidst the grim reality of her situation. She sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. "David, please," Emily started, her voice weak. "You've got to understand, I never meant for any of this to happen. She stopped as if searching for the right words. "I was just trying to be someone, to be better. But now everything's falling apart and I need your help." David's gaze didn't soften. "Help? You want help? You think you deserve help after everything you've done?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. She flinched, but she didn't back down. "I'm sorry, David. I never meant to hurt you. I swear I thought I could control it all. But I made a mistake. And now I have nothing left. If you could just—" David leaned forward, cutting her off. "No, Emily. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. Over and over again. You chose him. You chose the money. You chose yourself." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was like she was choking on her own guilt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she whispered, "I know. I know I screwed everything up. But please, David, I can't lose everything. I can't. Please." David's face remained cold, his expression unwavering. "You already have. Everything you built is gone. Your reputation. Your career. Your future. You've lost it all." Emily's eyes welled up with tears. The once powerful woman who had played everyone, who had controlled the narrative, was now reduced to begging. But David wasn't moved. He wasn't going to let her manipulate him again. "You had the chance to be someone better, Emily," he said, his voice low. "But instead you chose this path. You brought this all on yourself." A silence fell between them. Emily's breath quickened as she realized just how far she had fallen. Her eyes scanned the room, desperate for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left. No escape. No safety. Only David, who had become the final judge of her actions. "David?" Her voice cracked and she didn't finish the sentence. David didn't need her to. Her defeat was written all over her face. She was broken. Her spirit, her career, her life. He stood up slowly as if savoring the final moment. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, the woman who had betrayed him, who had stolen everything from him. "You didn't just ruin me, Emily," he said softly. "You ruined yourself." And with that, he turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her to face the full weight of her downfall.